This presentation has three main parts. Firstly, I'm going to talk about the introduction to qualitative method synthesis. Secondly, I will introduce you to the most widely used methodological approach in this area. It's called meta-ethnography, laid out by Noble and Harris in the late 1980s. Lastly, we will look at what methodological appraisal might look like with qualitative studies. It can be a bit confusing at first. Systematic synthesis of qualitative data goes by several different names. It can be referred to as meta-ethnography or meta-summary or qualitative meta-analysis or grounded theory, and many of these approaches are similar. Majority of Noble and Harris 7 stages approach. But what researchers can use are different, and they use different terms to describe what they're doing for different reasons. We will use the term meta-ethnography, also use the term qualitative synthesis. We can compare meta-ethnography to methodologies one may be much familiar with. Firstly, the narrative literature review most students have written several times over the course of their undergraduate years. But meta-ethnography is completely different in terms of their aims and scope. Qualitative systematic reviews is from a family of methodological approaches to critically reviewing research evidence. Qualitative systematic reviews have proliferated in health sciences research, particularly in the field of nursing. Certain factors have led to rise in their popularity. Some of it is greater public skepticism about expertise, a greater willingness to challenge expert scientific knowledge, and the growing importance in the role of user voices. There's also recognition that many health problems of care do not fit into experimental research designs. It is also important to bear in mind that there is no standard method of combining qualitative studies. Qualitative method synthesis is characterized by the integration of key themes from research that explores common subject matter. Guided principle behind this comparative integration is a desire to enhance understanding of a subject and to be able to make use more general statements of a phenomena under observation. The strength of meta-synthesis is situated in the fact that comparing, contrasting, and synthesizing a large number of studies grant access to an underlying reality which is not apparent in the examination of the individual studies. How can meta-ethnographies contribute knowledge to the knowledge base? To answer this, I have to introduce you to the idea of first, second, and third order construct. The information contained in an empirical research paper can be coded as first order construct. This would be the research participants' experiences. This could be in the form of a quote or a summary of what they have to say with their experience. You can also quote second order concepts. This would be the researchers' interpretations of what they have said. What meta-ethnographic contributes is that they reinterpret the researchers' concepts. These are the 7 stages of meta-ethnographic method. In practice, it is important to bear in mind the phases may occur in parallel or overlapping times, and quality appraisal of studies you are looking at will also run alongside the process. This is the model showing how the phases will typically proceed from one another, not necessarily in a linear fashion, and it also shows how it is linked with one another. The first stage is identifying an area of intellectual interest that synthesizes of qualitative research might inform. The form of the synthesis might be revised through reading of the qualitative studies. You only may start with an area that is interesting to you and then you develop that through reading and researching on what has been written on the topic. Other areas that make good candidates for qualitative syntheses are that have systematic reviews, meta-analysis is done, and perhaps they have made very little use of qualitative studies in the area. When narrowing down your area of interest, it is important to bear in mind that the questions you are going to be asking in a meta-ethnography are going to be very different from a systematic review or meta-analysis. So, systematic reviews and meta-analysis typically ask whether an intervention works for a particular outcome. Metasynthetic methodologies firstly allow researchers to access the key information such as contextual factors, processes, and subjective experiences. We are interested in how the programs work. So you would be asking questions as how does qualitative analysis explain why an intervention might work while others may not? The second stage is deciding what is relevant to the initial interest. So study selection should be driven according to Noble and Harris some substantiative interest derived from comparison of any given set of studies. Searches for studies need not to be exhaustive, because unless it is a substantiative reason for an exhaustive search, generalizing from all studies of a particular setting yields trite conclusions. So the issue about how much searching to do has been disputed by some researchers, who argue that searches for qualitative studies may need to employ somewhat different strategies than searches for quantitative studies. Qualitative journals and papers may not be indexed in the same mainstream databases as quantitative papers. Qualitative studies may more likely to appear as book chapters are published in the gray literature. Gray literature is literature published by organizations outside of academia, typically more difficult to find in searches. Here are some things to consider for searching for relevant studies. You may want to set a time frame whereby you only consider studies published within that period. Otherwise, you may find yourself in a vast amounts of paper to go through. Secondly, most reviews only consider English language studies, which is obviously a great loss of information. Without a high quality translation, it can be very difficult to include any of these studies. Many studies often publish in English language abstracts, so you could possibly see from that if you could potentially include a study in your analysis. You can also try contacting the corresponding author to check if they have a translation of the paper that you could use. Thirdly, there are many different databases. One of the helpful ones is Google Scholar. I found ResearchGate a good website to search as well. And there are also topic-specific databases such as criminal justice abstracts. I would check recent reviews in your fields for the databases they have studied and try searching those as well. You also need to spend some time thinking about your keyword searches. You want to get as many relevant papers as possible and as few irrelevant ones as possible. You can use a combination of general and specific search types. So a study of music programs at prisons may be music plus prison, music plus offenders, or more specifically, drums plus prison. And you can try a variety of those terms. And you can see how many papers are returned to you. You can also hand search reference lists in papers. You can consider contacting the experts in the field, as they may know other work or papers that you can include. For your analysis, you should look into 40 papers or under. It will result in a trade-off between breadth of included papers and the depth of scrutiny and thought invested in each stage of the synthesis. Once the studies have been screened into review, the key characteristics of each study are usually displayed in a table setting. Such tables can run for many pages, but could be shorter. They may also contain a summary of the study, and the author may also These tables include some basic information about each study and its participants. This table reduces your word count and is much easier to read for your audience. Also, very easy to compare the various different studies in your analysis and searching through a large amount of descriptive text. Our third stage involves the dedicated readings of our studies and noting of concepts of themes, paying close attention to the details of the studies and what they tell you about your area of interest. This can be done by hand, of course, but using software such as NVivo or atlas.ti will save you lots of time and help you keep things organized. Noble and Hare recommends creating a list of key metaphors, phrases, ideas, or concepts and the relations used in each account and just oppose them. In order to make an initial assumption about how the studies relate to one another, this informs the type of synthesis that will be then carried. So there are three main types of synthesis: a reciprocal, a refutational, or a line of argument synthesis. Translating studies into one another is a key concept of meta-ethnographic synthesis. Meta-ethnography is just a way of systemizing and formalizing it and then communicating what you have done. This type of synthesis will relate to how one study is related to one another. Our first one, reciprocal translation. This is where concepts of one study incorporate those of another. For example, Force and Pellico in 2011 did a reciprocal translation of women's post-incarceration experiences. They derived 4 themes from their analysis. They named them tenuous transitions, once a criminal, always a criminal, downward spiral, and tipping points. They used a table to display how each theme appears in each study. It can be called individual study metaphors. We should not underestimate the time taken to do such an analysis as these. The degree of skills needed to summarize detailed and complex themes can be quite considerable. But in terms of communicating the synthesis in such a precise way contains a lot of value. Our second mode of synthesis would be refutational translation. This is in contrast concepts in different studies contradicting one another. As Campbell says, when studies refute one another, it requires a more elaborate set of translations involving translations of the both ethnographic accounts and the refutations of examining the implied relationship between the competing explanations. So if you're looking at doing a study on solitary confinement, you might have a study that says it's harmful and provides research evidence of this. You might find a second study that's the opposite and provides evidence of that. You might find a third study that says solitary confinement can provide benefit for some time for certain circumstances. This is an actual debate in criminology. A refutational translation might enable you to get to the bottom of this debate. So where there is a plausible explanation of for example, an apparent contradiction between studies, particularly in a difference in a healthcare setting, then they express this as third-order contract. Finally, a line of argument synthesis involves the development of a new model theory or understanding by synthesizing and interpreting a second-order construct. If we remember, our first-order contract were the research participants' experiences, and the second-order constructs the researcher's interpretation of those experiences. Many studies suggest a line of argument synthesis of or inference of a larger issue or phenomenon, and this involves translating studies into another and then constructing an interpretation called the line of argument. They may serve to reveal what's hidden in individual studies and involves detailed studies of differences or similarities amongst these to be synthesized. Studies are usually placed in some sort of logical order so that a line of argument can be constructed. For example, a study about drug use and the treatment in the criminal justice, there will be one or more studies looking at the context of the drug users committing crime. The second set of studies might look at the perspective on treatment in prison, and the third group of studies may look at the struggles associated with recovery and their re-entry into the community. Our sixth stage is synthesizing the translation. How the product is synthesized would depend on how the studies relate to one another. The seventh stage involves expressing the syntheses. This is our final stage. This is to communicate our synthesis with our audience, and this is given a considerable amount of emphasis by Noblet and Hare. They state that the worth of any synthesis is in its comprehensibility to some audience. They describe the needs of the audience, primarily researchers and policymakers, as influencing the both form and substance of the synthesis. It is really produced with their needs in mind, and some understanding of the audience's culture therefore required to ensure relations of the studies in the syntheses you have produced. If the data is inadequate or the audience cannot understand the connection between the data and the argument, then the study becomes unbelievable to the audience. Comprehensibility and believability are central to determining worth. The process of evaluating the quality of the methodologies of the studies you will be using in your synthesis, was something that should run alongside the 7 steps I have just talked you through. The use of quality checklist for qualitative research is quite controversial. It's being challenged by many researchers, and the first thing to bear in mind is that there is no absolute list of criteria to what constitute good qualitative research. There are also those that argue that there is nothing unique about qualitative research, and traditional definitions of reliability, validity, objectivity, and realizability apply towards both qualitative and quantitative methodologies, and those who contend that there should be no criteria for judging qualitative research outcomes. It may be the case the qualitative research need to use conceptions of trustworthiness and authenticity to replace the traditional criteria of validity, reliability, or objectivity. Another example of a really commonly used qualitative checklist is called the Critical Appraisal Skills Program, or CASP checklist. You can find if a study is valid and what the results are. One thing to take away is quality appraisal is inherently subjective, and words of matter are of the researcher's opinion. Another thing to bear in mind is that the quality appraisal is also very time consuming.